NATO foreign ministers gathered in Belgium as a temporary truce in Gaza came to an end and as fighting escalates in the ongoing war in Ukraine. Some in the 31-member alliance had hoped to formally welcome Sweden into the security bloc this week, but the Nordic country's ratification is still pending. The Turkish parliament has delayed approving Sweden's membership bid, citing the country's slow progress on tackling terrorist groups that have directly threatened Turkey. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has also stressed that stalling talks on Turkey's EU membership has affected Ankara's decision on Sweden's NATO accession. The war in Ukraine topped the agenda at the latest NATO meeting, where Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg vowed to support Kiev, both on the battlefield and its possible membership into the alliance. Fighting has intensified in recent weeks after Russia conducted its largest drone attack on Kiev. Meanwhile, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan held meetings with his U.S. counterpart Antony Blinken, reiterating Turkey's desire to sustain delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. On Friday, Israel resumed military operations in the besieged enclave after a week-long truce failed to get extended. And for more on the latest NATO foreign ministers meeting, joining me now from Istanbul is Matthew Bryza. He is a former U.S. ambassador. And from Oslo, Glenn Diesen. He's a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Glenn, did anything significant come out of the NATO foreign ministers summit in Belgium? Were there any breakthroughs?
No, I would say it went largely as expected. So large words of solidarity. But I guess beneath all of this, there are, of course, growing divisions and problems. So I think this was seen among the main topics. Ukraine, for example, I think it's becoming increasingly evident that NATO has lost this war. We have Israel and Palestine, where, of course, the other NATO members have alienated Turkey to a large extent. We have the issue of Sweden possibly joining NATO, but so far it's been obstructed by Hungary and Turkey. And of course, we have the issue of Iran, in which there's concern about the U.S. occupation forces being attacked from Iraq to Syria, and of course Iran. So the problems are growing, and I didn't see any huge breakthroughs. I think they really wanted to announce Sweden a session for this summit, and obviously that wouldn't have happened either. So.
Yes, we're going to talk about this. But Matthew, as Glenn mentioned, there are some small divisions within NATO when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and now with a new conflict in Gaza, other divisions are starting to emerge. What do you think with almost all of the member states, except for Turkey? They have been backing Israel from the day one, but now some criticism of its disproportionate attack on Gaza starting to come out of Western capitals. So is this adding strain on the alliance?
Well, I actually don't see very much strain within the alliance, but because there's unanimity on the need to support Ukraine in principle. But it's true that Hungary doesn't want to provide more aid to Ukraine, and Hungary, for years under Viktor Orban, has been sort of a problem child within NATO. What was significant, by the way, this is a preparatory meeting, right, for the NATO summit that happens every June. The most significant outcome, I think, from judging by Jens Stoltenberg's statements, was the first meeting ever of the NATO-Ukraine Council, where NATO actually underscored its continuing support for Ukraine, and both militarily and politically. I talked about ways to increase support to Ukraine. But when it comes to Gaza and Israel's war on Hamas, I do agree that there are growing strains throughout the world, but really between Israel and everybody else. Yes, the United States is in for understandable criticism for having been such a staunch supporter of Israel throughout the war. On the other hand, in recent days, and in fact weeks, the Biden administration has begun putting pressure on Netanyahu. We've had repeated statements by Biden and Blinken saying there needs to be much less killing of civilians. I think Netanyahu's feeling the pressure, but he's determined to keep pressing forward, and we're entering a very dark period.
So, Glenn, what do you think if we see a report of civilian death toll in this new round of attacks by Israel? Will NATO members start speaking out more? And how would a prolonged conflict between Israel and Hamas impact NATO's interests in the region and beyond?
Well, I think that immediately after the attack by Hamas, NATO countries were very understandingly shocked, and they also therefore pledging support for Israel. But this is also what we tend to do on autopilot, so to give unconditional support to Israel. However, I think what has followed, the Israeli response, as we see the horrific war crimes and ethnic cleansing being committed by Israel, I think it spooked many of the Europeans, even some of the on the other side of the Atlantic as well. So I think that the unconditional support for Israel, many fear that it's made us complicit. And given the very genocidal language, not genocide yet, but genocidal language is also creating much concern. So I do think there will be more or greater pushback. But I think so far there can still be unity in NATO. I think we usually find unity through strategic ambiguity. So we can call for caution and criticize some of the war crimes by Israel, but we won't do anything at all to restrain Israel. Of course, Israel is very much dependent on the United States. If they would want to change Netanyahu's policies, they could. But of course, this is not going to happen. But I think this is the balance we're going to strike. But this can very easily become a regional war. And I think at that point, once Hezbollah or any of the neighbors get involved, I think that's when it becomes a much greater problem for the NATO countries.
So, Matthew, as you just briefly mentioned, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg has said Ukraine is closer to NATO membership more than ever before. Is this really the case? And what would it take for the country to become a member of this military alliance, since it is still at war with Russia?
Well, I think that is a true statement, but it really does not mean that much, because even the United States is not in favor of rapid membership of Ukraine in NATO. And even President Zelensky himself has said, we realize that there's no way Ukraine can be admitted to NATO in the middle of a war with Russia, since all of the alliance would then be automatically at war with Russia. What Zelensky has been looking for is an invitation to join when the time is right. He got half of that at the last NATO summit. He got a commitment from NATO saying Ukraine will be able to join NATO once all existing members of NATO accept that, and once Ukraine has fulfilled all the conditions. So that's really an empty statement. But I think what the point is that the political will and sort of the assumption that Ukraine will join NATO, it is stronger than it ever has been before. So besides ending the war, Russia's war on Ukraine, then of course Ukraine has a lot of reforms to go through as well. Fighting corruption is one. Military reforms, which have been extensive, need to continue. And then, of course, Ukraine's military capabilities need to further their adaptation to NATO standards and equipment.
So, Glenn, one of the major issues on the alliance's agenda was, of course, Sweden's membership into NATO, but obviously that didn't happen. So are there signs that NATO allies are putting some pressure on Ankara to approve Stockholm's membership, and why its membership is so important right now?
Well, I'm not sure what's happening behind the scenes, but obviously there are pressures on Turkey to approve Sweden being able to join NATO. So I think it's probably important for NATO now, because keep in mind that Sweden always had a majority of the population opposing this, but the military always favored it. So I think when Russia invaded, there was obviously need to exploit this situation, because if this war comes to an end and things calm down, public opinion might shift. So I think it's an interest to pull in Sweden as soon as possible. But I think also that Sweden would be a very important component of NATO, because as former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen stated, if NATO and Finland are part of NATO, then NATO can effectively put a blockade, if they will, on St. Petersburg in the Baltic Sea. And this is largely, what NATO is about. It's about containing Russia. And if you want to contain Russia, it has free access to the seas. So in the high north, but that's where the Americans are now setting up more military presence in Norway. And then they have the blockade in the Baltic Sea. And of course, that's why we're fighting the Russians to gain access and get Crimea. So this is the three seas which we're looking for. So Sweden is a key component, obviously.
So, Matthew, what do you think? Is Sweden's membership imminent, as claimed by the country's foreign minister? Because Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said there is no certain time frame for its approval at the Turkish parliament. What do you, as a former diplomat, what do you make of these statements? I mean, was it a case of miscommunication between the two foreign ministers, or it was a pressure tactic by Stockholm?
No, I think, of course, Stockholm understands that the Grand National Assembly and its Foreign Affairs Committee has to take a decision when it's ready. I think it probably was a miscommunication. Sweden's style diplomatically is not to put pressure really on anyone publicly. In private, yes, but not publicly. If you look at also statements coming out of Washington recently, the State Department at a senior level has been saying, again, the Grand National Assembly needs to go through whatever process it needs to approve Sweden's membership. Having said that, of course, the assumption is that Turkey, as a great NATO ally, is going to eventually to approve Sweden's membership in NATO. And by the way, that'll be a very stabilizing factor. As Glenn said, yes, well, I put it a different way. Russia will no longer be able to threaten the Baltic states in the Baltic Sea once Finland and Sweden are member states. And we have to remember, there's no intent by NATO to blockade Russia or ever to attack Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance. If you look at its strategic concept, it said, yes, Russia is an adversary and it needs to be deterred, not blockaded, not injured, but deterred.
So, Glenn, how will approving, let's say, Sweden's membership impact Ankara and Budapest's relations with Moscow? What do you think the Russian position will be?
Well, Russia would see this as a concern, of course, because they see and have seen NATO expansion as being an existential threat to the Russian Federation. Again, this shouldn't be controversial. We've seen everyone from George Kennan to William Perry, William Burns, all these American leaders have kind of confirmed this over the years, over the past 30 years. So, and this is, of course, also a threat to Russia. Now, I wouldn't say that NATO would be. I think that NATO gave up being a defensive alliance when it attacked Yugoslavia, when it attacked Libya. So again, also when it toppled the government in Ukraine, trying to make this into a proxy now against Russia. And I think after what we've seen the past 2 years, I don't think we can really say that NATO is not a threat to Russia anymore. So I think obviously the Russians will be very concerned, and it will, weaken relations further, and we'll have greater conflicts with the Russians to come. Keep in mind that Finland was the greatest success story for neutrality for so long. And no one ever thinks that Russia would invade Finland, but now they've become the largest front line of NATO against Russia. So we can't pretend as if this is not going to destabilize relations, when this obviously the Russians will have to respond to this in some way in the future.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.